Namaste dear learners, and welcome back to the MOOC certificate course on quantitative and mixed method research. I am Dr. Sumita Mishra, Dean, KIT School of Management, KIT Team to be University, with you again on a brand new topic in week 3, session 3 of this course. I continue from Dr. R.N. Subudhi, who has already taken 2 sessions in this week, and he has spoken about probability sampling and sampling in quantitative studies. So today our topic of discussion will be sampling for qualitative studies. So learners, when we talk of sampling in qualitative studies, the first of the terms that comes to our minds or that we hear is called as a purposive sample. So what is the meaning of a purposive sample? It is selecting units, and what do we mean by units? It is individuals, groups, institutions based on specific purposes associated with answering a research studies thesis questions. Now, to have a better definition about what a purposive sample is, Maxwell in 1997 has defined purposive sampling as a type of sampling in which particular persons, settings, or events are deliberately selected for the important information that they can provide that cannot be gotten well from other choices. Now here I would like to divert your attention to the statement deliberately selected. Now the minute we are using these words deliberately selected, we are excluding any choice of equal selection or equal representation of the sampling frame. So which brings us to the next question, that how is a purposive sample different from probability sampling? In order to answer this question, I will take you to sampling in qualitative research. How do we exactly do sampling in qualitative studies, and what are the key features of sampling in qualitative studies as pointed out by Curtis and colleagues in 2000. Now there are 6 major features which will also tell you the difference of qualitative sampling from quantitative sampling. Now the first of these is that it is not based on statistical probability but on theoretical criteria. Now what does this statement mean? Now when we talk about statistical probability, as Dr. Subudhi has already explained to you in the earlier sessions during the week, there is a pre-decided sample size calculation which normally takes place in quantitative research designs, but you will not find the very same in qualitative studies because these samples are guided by the choice of theoretical criteria which is embedded in the research questions of the study. Now to give you an illustration here, for example, let us say that I am looking at the impact or the influence or possible influences of cultural diversity on knowledge sharing patterns in Indian software teams. So in this case, what is my theoretical criteria? And to give you a very simplistic example, one of my theoretical criteria is to select Indian team members who are a part of software teams. Now the question is, we all use it very commonly that yes, these would be our respondents, or the better word for respondents is informants in qualitative studies. But I need to ask myself a question, that what do I understand by the meaning of the word Indian? Who is an Indian, and why do I consider certain features in a person to be Indian to be a part of my study? So these are theoretical criteria which would then decide the kind of choice that I would make for the selection of my sample size. So this is the first point. The second is samples are small and they yield large amount of information. So we don't look at large samples with small information, rather we look at small samples with large amount of information. The third point is actually the most defining difference between sampling for quantitative studies and sampling for qualitative studies. Samples are not pre-decided or pre-specified. In a quantitative study design, we will always pre-decide the sample size before we go on to data collection, but we don't indulge in a similar activity in qualitative research. Sample selections are driven by the conceptual framework of the study. They are once again not decided on the basis of statistical probability, but rather they are guided by the choice of theoretical criteria and the conceptual framework that a researcher would have for study. So please understand that if I am looking at point number 1 and point number 4, gradually I come to the conclusion, or I bring my learners to the conclusion, that sampling in qualitative research does not depend on probability sampling, rather purposive sampling, or the chief method of sampling in qualitative studies, is non-probabilistic in nature. Now, coming to the fifth point, because we follow a non-probabilistic sampling, sample selection must make transparent the process of selection and omission. We should be very, very careful about the kind of respondents / informants who we select into our study. But I think as a qualitative researcher myself, I should be even more careful with the criteria for omission of respondents / informants in our study. So we should know that why we select certain people into the study and why we do not deliberately select others. So this should be very clearly and transparently stated at the onset. Now, what is the last point? Samples help in making analytic generalization and not statistical generalization. Please remember that qualitative studies need to remain true to their contexts always, and they do not depend on statistical generalization, where you generalize or you generalize with caution the results of one particular study into other contexts. Now, coming to the size of qualitative samples, what are the key features here? First, if the data are properly analyzed, there will come a point where very little new evidence is obtained from each additional fieldwork unit. And what is the meaning of each additional fieldwork unit? It is the unit of analysis. For example, our unit of analysis is an Indian team member. So each additional Indian team member will not give very many new bits and pieces of evidence if we have made our data collection process and sampling techniques very clear from the beginning. And this brings us to the next point, that law of diminishing returns apply. And what does this mean? That if sampling techniques and data collection processes are transparent from the beginning, then we will collect less and less new data from every new additional respondent / informant who is introduced into the sample. So here I will once again connect my discussions to the previous points that I made, where I spoke about the differences between quantitative sampling and qualitative sampling, that why are samples not pre-decided in qualitative studies. In qualitative studies, we collect data to the point of saturation, and these 2 points demonstrate whatever I am just mentioning right away. Now, what is the meaning of collecting data to the point of saturation? Such point of saturation demonstrates that absolutely no new evidence is emerging from data that is collected from an additional unit. So once we see a pattern emerging in the data, we decide that yes, the sample is saturated or the data is saturated, and we need not introduce new informants or new units of analysis into the sample frame. Now, what is the second point? Statements about incidence or prevalence are not the concern of qualitative research. So, typically, for example, let us say that I want to understand that whether there is any influence of training evaluation on training transfer. So, in a quantitative study, I want to know that among my sample respondents, if I have collected or if I have distributed the questionnaire to nearly 500 people who have undertaken a training program, I would want to know that how many of these people believe that yes, training evaluation has got a positive influence on training transfer. But that is not the concern of a qualitative study. I am not interested in how many or how many to what extent, but rather I am interested in knowing that why training evaluation will lead to any kind of positive, post-training transfer onto the job. So, learners, I will try to explain this point further in the kind of supplement that I will associate with this class, with this demonstration, so that you are able to understand the difference in the perspective of a qualitative researcher vis-a-vis a quantitative researcher. So, once again I am reiterating here that if I am looking at a quantitative researcher, what would a quantitative researcher do if he is faced with a question? So, if my question is looking at the influences of training evaluation on post-training transfer on the job, I am asking how many. Okay, how many of my sample believe that yes, this is true? But if I am a qualitative researcher, I am not interested in knowing how many, but rather I am interested in just answering this question, that how or why would there be a connection between the two. Okay. Now come to the third point. The third is talking about the type of information that qualitative studies yield. The type of information that qualitative studies yield is very, very rich in detail. If your data collection process and your sampling technique is clear to you and to the scientific community from the beginning, then you will have rich data from every single unit that you introduce in the qualitative sample. So, the size of the qualitative sample is necessarily small, otherwise you will not be able to do justice to the kind of data that you are collecting from every single person who you are collecting the data from. So, please remember, when we are looking at quantitative studies, we are looking at the breadth of the sample. Okay? How many are you able to introduce, because that is what will maintain statistical probability and help you in statistical generalization. But when we are looking at a qualitative sampling, then we are not looking at the breadth, but rather we are looking at the depth of the sample, that how much of data are you able to collect from every single unit who you are introducing into the sample frame. Now, coming to the next issue that I wanted to discuss in qualitative research, there is a need to highlight accessibility. And why do I talk about this? Because management research is extremely applied, and most of the management research that we do in different disciplines or specializations of management is based on organizations. So, for all researchers who are operating within the purview of management, the domain of management, they need to highlight their accessibility to an organization in very, very transparent terms. My source here is Alexander and Smith in 2019, who have talked on this in detail, and I will be sharing the reference in my video supplement. So, what are the access details here that we need to provide? The first is the organization discovery. And what is the explanation given? That how did the researcher background help in locating the organization? Let us say, for example, you are a IT professional yourself. You would have access to different other organizations, or you would have information about different other organizations which are in the same industry. The next is insider or outsider assistance. This is very important, because it asks you the question that who helped you, but who necessarily did not authorize access. Somebody may give you the access to the organization, whereas somebody may give you the information to the organization. So, here when I am talking about insider, outsider assistance, we are talking about who has given you the information about the organization where you can possibly collect data. Then the next is gatekeepers, the role or the position of the person who is authorizing access. And the last is very important, because it talks about a potential conflict of interest that you may have in the decision about your sample or your organization for your study, and that is called exchange. What are the benefits to the organization who is granting you access? There are many types of purposive sampling, and to understand these typologies better, we have assembled them into 4 different categories. The first is sampling to achieve comparability, the second is sampling of special cases, the third is sequential sampling, and the fourth is sampling using combinations. Now, this, if you look at this entire table, this provides a world view or the entire world of purposive sampling. So, you will get a bird's eye view of all possible techniques which are used in purposive samples. But while discussing these typologies, I would like to emphasize on the fact that I will take up very specific types which are predominantly used by qualitative researchers in their studies. And in my supplement to the video, I shall also be providing the complete reference for the table that has been created for you. Now, let us start with the first. The first is purposive sampling to achieve comparability. Now, what are the objectives? The first is to find instances that are representative or typical of a particular type of case on a dimension of interest. And the second is sampling in order to achieve comparability across different types of cases on a dimension of interest. Now, for example, and I take you back to the previous example that I had introduced while discussing the sample size considerations for qualitative studies. Now, let us say my interest is to understand that whether cultural diversity in teams has any impact on knowledge sharing patterns from the perspective of Indian team members. Then what is the meaning of the word typical for me? What is a typical case sampling? I enter into organizations which have the instance of teams which are culturally diverse, and any member who is working, who is an Indian, satisfying my criteria of what I mean as a Indian, would be a typical case for me in typical case sampling, because he or she becomes my unit of analysis. So what are my objectives here? That I am able to compare one informant with the other, and I am able to collect as much data as possible on the dimension of interest, or basically what I mean is the focus of my study. So that is the meaning of typical case sampling. Now let's come to the next, which is maximum variation sampling. Maximum variation sampling is probably very important in purposive sampling, because that will reduce the possibility of biases that a non-probabilistic sampling can have. Now what is the meaning here? The basic principle beside or behind maximum variation sampling is to gain greater insights into a phenomena by looking at it from different angles. Now particularly when we are looking at Indian team members who have been a part of culturally diverse teams, we should be very careful about maintaining a wide range in terms of demography. And what is the meaning here? That I should have people from different age categories, I should have people from different gender categories, from different tenure categories, from different experience categories, from different industry categories as well. So if I am able to introduce the concept of maximum variation, then what would happen is there is a possibility for a reduction in bias. Please remember that we are not able to eliminate bias altogether in sample size considerations or in the choice of sample, but there is definitely a possibility to reduce bias. The third type is extreme or deviant case sampling, and to explain what extreme or deviant case sampling would mean, I will take the example of firm turnarounds. Now what is the meaning of the word turnaround? Turnaround basically depicts the journey of a firm which comes back to profit making again from the verge of bankruptcy. Now if I want to study this, I can go two ways, or let's say how do I study this phenomena using extreme or deviant case sampling. There are two things that I can do here. Either I look at cases of great success in turnaround strategies, or I look at great failures in turnaround strategies. I will talk here about great success. Now if I am interested in looking at extremely successful instances of firm turnaround, then I may look at organizations like Continental Airlines, which are always taken as illustrations in the MBA classrooms as to how a leader can shape the fate of a firm which was already on the verge of bankruptcy and bring it back to the Fortune 500 list of companies again. So I look at two categories here, either a tremendous success or a resounding failure. So both of them are basically outliers on both ends of the spectrum. So that's how I would call it extreme or deviant case sampling. Now let's move on to the next category, which is very interesting as it's purposive sampling of special or unique cases. Now why do we do these samplings? These sampling techniques include special or unique cases which have always been a focus in qual research. What are the types here? So the first is revelatory sampling. What is the meaning of revelation? Revelation is an insight that you may not have gained before. So what is the meaning of revelatory sampling? It involves identifying and gaining entry to a single case representing a phenomena that has previously been inaccessible for scientific investigation. That means it is something that you understand for the first time in doing research. And to give you examples of this, these are very interesting examples, and they may not have anything directly to do with the MBA classroom or MBA or management research, but they take you to the world where people have given insights for the first time and which have subsequently been the focus of many scientific investigations. So I'll take one example here, which is Corbett Thigpen and Hervé Cleckley, who have given us a beautiful treatise on what they call as the 3 phases of Eve. 3 phases of Eve was considered to be one of the first instances of doctors recording the multiple personality disorder. So, this was called as a revelatory sampling because something that was not known before was brought forth for scientific investigation for the first time. Similarly, the study of polygamy and polygyny in W.H. Durham's coevolution and so many others give you very good examples of revelatory sampling. Coming to the next, which is called critical case sampling, it is particularly important in exploratory qualitative research and a research with limited resources, because you do not have unlimited time, energy or funds to conduct sampling in qualitative studies. So, herein critical case sampling is very important. Now, it is a decisive aspect of critical sampling, case sampling, that it is arguably the most important. Now, to understand whether the case is decisive or critical, what are the questions that we may ask? That if it happens there, it will happen anywhere, or if it does not happen there, it won't happen anywhere. If that group is having problems, then can we be sure that all groups are having problems? For example, let us say you are interested to know that what would be the impact of video games on the attention span in teenagers. You have limited resources at your disposal and limited time at your disposal. So, what would you do? You would look at a case which can be a representative of other cases, because you are able to get answers of the questions that I have just posed right now, and conduct your research on that one case only. So, then that would become a critical case for you, which later on can be taken for a bigger study when you can draw a mixed method research design. Now, coming to politically important cases, these are not critical cases, but these cases have tremendous amount of political importance, and they have also yielded valuable theories in management research. Now, to give you an example of this, I'll take the first, which is Challenger and NASA. Now, the eruption of the space shuttle Challenger was possibly one of the greatest failures in NASA's history, and this was of political importance to the world over, and to be specific to the United States, because of the hype and publicity which was created around the Challenger. But Challenger's eruption also was the genesis of an important phenomena in management research, which was called as groupthink, and today groupthink is included as a part of the organization behavior discipline in the MBA classroom. And then let's come to something called as complete population sampling. So, what is the meaning of complete population sampling? It is a type of purposive sampling technique where you choose to examine the entire population. That means you don't say that sample is representative of the population, but you take into account the entire population, which has a set of particular characteristics. But you should be sure about one thing when you go about complete population sampling. And what is that? That the population that you are wishing to sample on is very specific, is small, and you cannot generate a representative sample from the population. Now, coming to sequential purposive sampling. Now, what is meaning here? What are the objectives here? These are all gradual sampling techniques which include rapid iteration between data collection and data analysis. That means what it says is that while you are doing sampling for data collection, your data analysis also goes hand in hand. And the first is very predominantly used in qualitative research, which is called theoretical sampling. Now, what is the meaning of theoretical sampling? Theoretical sampling was introduced by Glaser and Strauss in 1967 when they wrote their treatise on a very important framework of qualitative data analysis, which they called as grounded theory. So, what does it mean? The investigator samples people, institutions, documents or whatever according to how the theory leads the investigation. The sample size is never predetermined and sampling will continue till the point of saturation. Now, the next that we have with us is opportunistic sampling. Opportunistic or emergent sampling, as it's known, occurs when the researcher makes quick sampling decisions based on the process of collecting data. Now, let us say, for instance, you are collecting data or you are trying to understand workplace bullying behavior. And during the process of data collection, you understand that women in a certain age group have a tremendous propensity to be bullied in the organization that you are wishing to base your study on. So then that is an opportunity for you where you wish to collect more data from women of that particular age category. So it is by accident, or it is something that emerges during your data collection process and which gives you an opportunity to collect data. So that is opportunistic sampling. And the last of these is snowball sampling, which is a non-probability sampling technique where existing study subjects recruit future subjects from their acquaintances. Now, snowball sampling is also called as chain reaction sampling, and it is extremely required when the topic of study is very, very sensitive. For example, you are looking at instances of juvenile delinquency, or you are looking at instances of substance abuse among adolescents, teenagers and young adults. So these would be extremely sensitive to study. So snowballing is preferred in these instances. Now, because our MOOC certificate course focuses largely on mixed method research, we are also talking about mixed method sampling here. Now, look at the area that I am trying to bring in now, that how do you use sampling using multiple purposive techniques. Now, there is an example which was provided by Kaplan, and he used this as a demonstration to demonstrate the temporal and social contexts of heroin users. Basically, he was looking at substance abuse. So, a total of 214 cases was selected by 45 independent snowball sampling operations, and samples were collected with different target traits to saturate. So, in one target trait, in one subset we were saturating, or they were saturating for an origin, and while in another subset they were saturating occupation. So, if we look at this point where different traits were saturated, it was maximum variation sampling that was happening. But the overall idea of collecting respondents for the study was done through snowballing. So, and the third point here is very important. We can see how it happens, that let us say in every acquaintance that they had gone to, they had asked or recruited future acquaintances into the study. So, let us say there is a respondent which is myself from whom they are collecting data. I was asked to provide numbers of acquaintances who I know are using heroin. So, I had given them a subset of 5 to 6 people who I knew, and out of those 5 to 6 people, again a further random selection was done. Why random selection? Because this was the chance for the researcher to reduce biases in sampling techniques. So, if I look at multiple purposive techniques which were used here, they were primarily two. The first of them was snowballing, and the second of them was maximum variation sampling. So, now moving ahead, what are the guidelines for sample size in qualitative research? Because this is a very common question which is asked by students. So, commonly if we want to understand, these are not prescribed guidelines, but this is something that a researcher can go by. So, you can conduct 30 to 50 interviews if you are looking at a method of qualitative data analysis called ethnography. For grounded theory, on an average we collect 30 to 50 interviews to saturate data. For phenomenology, it can be 5 to 25, and in all qualitative research, 15 is the smallest accepted sample. But once again, my disclaimer here is that in your own study, which is a qualitative research design, please follow your instinct and keep collecting data till the point of saturation. This is just a guideline for reference and nothing to be followed in principle when you are going out to collect data, because dear learners, you should always remember that in qual studies no sample is ever pre-decided. It is the data, it is the informant that will help you saturate your data and decide the sample size you ultimately zero down on. So, if we look at today's class, what did we learn? To summarize, we understood what is the worldview of purposive sampling, how can it be different from probabilistic sampling, why are quantitative and qualitative samples different, what are the typologies of purposive sampling, and how can you do a mixed method qualitative sampling in a quali research design, and what can be some guidelines for preferential sample sizes in qualitative studies. So, I thank you all for your attention, and we meet again in week 4 of the MOOC certificate course on quantitative and mixed method research.